Welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio, coming to you on Sauga 960 AM. I have the pleasure of introducing our next guest. Her first appearance on Consumer Choice Radio, Conservative MP for Kildonan, St. Paul in Manitoba, Raquel Dancho. Thank you very much for joining us on CCR.
Great to be here, David. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Right off the bat, I've noticed a trend here where some of the younger conservative members of parliament have very loudly and very passionately, and in my opinion, very accurately highlighted the extent of the housing crisis and the unaffordability issue in Canada. Is that something that you feel will continue to carry on and become something that the Conservative Party as a whole embraces?
Oh, I think definitely. We have a whole host of millennial MPs who were elected in the 2019-2021 election who are very loud and proud about representing their generation, also representing the needs of all Canadians. And certainly we're seeing an inflation crisis, cost of living, and then housing. Millennials are the age where we're supposed to be buying our homes and sort of setting up our long-term retirement plans in that way, raising a family, having more space. And yet the data is telling us that half of our generation will likely never own a home, which is pretty shocking given that Canada is the second largest landmass on Earth, plenty of space to build homes. Millennials are the most educated, fully employed, dual income households, ever. And it's really shocking that after all that school we put ourselves through, we still can't buy homes, for example. So I think that this is a serious problem that's not going to go away anytime soon. And with the Liberal government, we hear day after day, we're doing so great. We're spending all of this money on housing. Those Conservatives don't support our initiatives. Well, in the 6 years that Trudeau's been in power, home prices have doubled. So I would argue that his policies have been a resounding failure and perhaps have even contributed to the rising cost of living and housing in this country.
Yeah, it's one the way I viewed what they've put together. It just feels like trying to tinker with demand, and in many senses, kind of sidestepping the elephant in the room, which is supply. They've touched on it a little bit, but I think it comes out to be 10% of what Ontario alone needs in terms of a housing increase. We've seen this develop now in the leadership race. A couple of the leadership contenders have started to talk about housing. I'll leave this as very open-ended because I know that you have not endorsed a candidate for Conservative leader yet. But how do you view the leadership campaign as it's unfolding now? What do you look for in whoever is going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party?
I think people are experiencing after, 2 years of the pandemic and 6 years of the Trudeau Liberals in power, there's a lot of alienation that's been going on. And then you compound that with high inflation, cost of living is increasing, housing is doubled in 6 years. You're getting a lot of alienated, angry people that are facing economic challenges, and in particular, the millennial generation that's feeling really left behind by their federal government, by governments generally. And so I think a candidate of the moment who's tapping into those grievances and is offering a bold voice for that solutions. That's what I was looking for a number of months ago when this leadership race started. I thought, we really need somebody bold with a clear vision that can inspire people and speak to their needs, meet them where they're at. And I think that there may be a bit of a generational shift as well. We're seeing a lot of young people take a lot of interest in the Conservative Party of Canada's leadership race. They're the most impacted. And we're seeing a number of candidates, Scott Aitchison, Pierre Poilievre, really talk about and dig into the housing issue, which is, again, of the moment. So I think the Conservatives were at a time where we could seize this opportunity and really speak to the issues of the day. And I think that there's a number of candidates that are doing that quite effectively.
Yeah, and the big thing that we've seen from Pierre and Scott so far is being bold enough to call out policies like exclusionary zoning, which is really limiting the housing stock, and for Scott going so far as kind of calling himself a YIMBY, which for the housing folks was quite exciting. Do you see zoning I mean, obviously it's a portion, but do you see it as the core problem here in terms of what's holding Canada back?
I think there's a number of issues, but certainly at the civic level, there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape for developers to create residential areas, to create more housing. It's much quicker. We see all the data tells us that it's much quicker to build anything just south of the border and a lot cheaper to do so. Coming to Canada, not a great place to build anything, it seems these days, which is, I think speaks to the Trudeau government's philosophy, but also when we get down to the civic level, the bureaucratic red tape we're seeing, certainly that has an impact. I think there's a number of things that have an impact, though, as well. Immigration and our population growth is growing very, very quick. I'm a supporter of immigration. It's important to grow our population, but at the same time, we need to look at when we're bringing in 1% of our population every year. Are we doing the work at the civic level to ensure we're building housing supply for all those new people coming in? Are we building schools and roads and wastewater treatment plants and hospitals to the capacity that we need? Are we building our neighborhoods? Are they equipped for that kind of influx? And if the answer is no, then there needs to be changes made to more rapidly develop our cities and our suburban areas. And so I think that there's a lot of different issues. And I think that was compounded during the pandemic. I think people who are kind of wanting to move into a bigger space were definitely motivated to do so after being stuck perhaps in a small apartment or a condo for
Hmm.
so long. I know that was the case with my husband and I are like, okay, now it's time to go to upsize because we're stuck here all the time. And I think that just compounded across the country as well.
You're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're speaking with Member of Parliament Raquel Dancho. The question, I think, is for the upcoming election season, for leadership elections. There's a lot of ideas that are being tossed around, particularly in the conservative camp. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations, pressure groups. There's a lot of different flavors of conservatism that evolve around Canada, and we are one of the most decentralized federations. Just a question as to your experience, coming from Manitoba, being in the scene there in Ottawa. What do you think are the core messages of conservatism that unite many of the provinces and many of the people who are a part of the party and those who might not yet be in the party that you think resonate with people?
This is the $1 million question, isn't it? What can unite the right and bring in those centrist voters that are switchers? I have a lot of thoughts on that. I don't know if any of them are the right ones, but I think certainly my background experience is quite unique. I grew up in rural Manitoba to four generations of farmers, and then I moved to Montreal to attend McGill University, very liberal place. So I have kind of a mixed view. My politics is heavily influenced by my background, of course, like most people. And I would say that there's a lot more that unites Canadians than divides them. But when you have a liberal government in power, we see this consistently, at least with Trudeau's when they're in power. They're very effective at dividing the country, alienating the West, firing up Quebec separatists. Rural versus urban is a growing issue in terms of divide and worldview. But for someone to unite the right, I think something that unites everybody on the right side is fiscal responsibility, first and foremost. And we're seeing none of that over the last number of years. Many people could argue we needed to spend all that money. I would say we spent more money per capita than in any other country in the world. So maybe it was a bit much. It certainly influences inflation. People are concerned about government deficits right now. And that's not always the case. It wasn't the case before the pandemic. But now the Liberal government has effectively normalized $58 billion deficits. There were headlines, oh, responsible budget. I'm like, are we looking at the same deficit? So I think that that's something that will ultimately bring conservatives together. It's time to focus on reducing taxes, but also being fiscally responsible. It's getting too expensive to live in Canada. We're not planning well for the future. So I would say that one certainly unites us. And then a secondary one, I would say to some extent, though it's been challenged a little bit during the pandemic, is freedom. Means different things to different people. Perhaps religious freedom, perhaps freedom to be an entrepreneur, a business owner, freedom over your own body. But freedom in general, that sort of individual autonomy to decide how you're going to live your life in a free country like Canada, should be uniting for all Canadians. But certainly, I think to the right, it's something that is very important to us as well.
Well, as a
And
graduate of Concordia, I don't blame you for going to McGill. But
Oh, Concordia.
yeah,
Nice.
one quick thing I had on that is, what do you think the main lesson is that Canadians have learned after the pandemic when it comes to the relationship to government?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that there is a lot of folks who put a lot of trust in government generally, or don't really think about it. The government puts out something, that's okay, that's what we're going to do. But there was certainly, we saw a bit of a challenge on that in the last 2 years. I think that's not a surprising, but we saw folks, like classic examples early on is like, this doesn't transmit easily person to person, the virus, the masks don't work, like all closing borders is crazy. And then we saw very much that wasn't the case. Vaccines, for example, as well, we brought them in. It was supposed to be a 2-dose kind of thing, and then we're one and done for the rest of our lives. We also were told vaccines stop you from getting it and spreading it. We also know that's not the case. So there was a lot of things government tried really, really hard. Our government scientists and healthcare professionals tried really hard and used the best science they could. But when you say something and it impacts people at every level of their life, where they can stand, what they can put on their bodies, what they have to put in their bodies, who they can have at their own home, if they can get married and have funerals, all types of things, I think that ups the pressure on a government official to make the right decision. And in a very evolving situation like the pandemic, there was a lot of mistakes made. Hindsight's 2020. But I think anyone who is a suspect of government or skeptical, I think that was cranked up significantly. And for other populations who maybe really, really trust government and regulation, perhaps it was a time where they just kind of let go of the wheel and say, government, just tell me what to do. And I think that divide, we were seeing that manifest in its most extreme form in the protests that took over Ottawa, its downtown parliamentary area, a couple months ago. So now's the time to sort of bring people together. And I think for government to step back a little bit and let people have responsibility over their own lives again, and hopefully get back to some normalcy.
I'm curious if this certainly wouldn't be the case for everybody, but I'm curious if that message, that freedom message, may resonate more so now with Canadians, again, in their own way, just for the sole reason of a lot of people are exhausted by all of the rules, the changing of the rules. Yael
Yeah.
talked at length about the original noble lie and telling people not to wear masks, and then masks became mandatory. And it was like, well, the data originally from Taiwan was showing that they were good. We would have done public health a lot of good, both from a frustration point and a COVID perspective, to just come out of the gate and say, hey, we encourage people to wear masks rather than have that flip flop. But um, I think there is a possibility that that message could resonate with people as that level of exhaustion increases, and maybe they want a little more freedom. They want a little more autonomy is probably the better word rather than freedom, because
Mhm.
that can mean all sorts of different things. We have about 2 minutes left here, and you mentioned the switchers, and this is where fiscal restraint, and I had the same view looking at the headlines. It seems to me like the era of Paul Martin and Chrétien for liberals is gone. And I'm wondering if you think that there are maybe some of those centrist or blue liberals who may be looking for a new home, watching our kind of fiscal standing deteriorate.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at two groups of people. Blue liberals is one of them. So someone who maybe, often we find people may describe themselves as, oh, I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative, and they tend to switch between parties. They would have voted for Harper in 2011, but perhaps have since voted Trudeau since 2015. And now they're getting worried about tax increases, inflation, cost of living, deficits, things like that. And I think you're bang on. That is an opportunity for us, particularly to talk in the leadership race, and then whoever our new leader is, to really say we're the ones that are going to be responsible stewards of the fiscal purse, as we have been, as conservatives are. It's really part of it's part of our being across the country, and has been us for many, many years. So that's one sort of, is the switchers there, the perhaps conservative liberal switchers. But there's another group of people I think is quite interesting. It's some perhaps you can describe blue collar NDP voters that may vote the way that their union votes,
Mhm.
provincially NDP, federally liberal perhaps. I don't think those folks, but also federally NDP, I don't think those folks are identifying at all with the message from the NDP leader, and they certainly don't like Justin Trudeau. I think that that's a real area of growth that conservatives can lean into. Hardworking, everyday Canadians who build the country around us, who have been completely left behind by this sort of woke college federal NDP, I would describe them and their policies, I think. And then the Liberals who are kind of eating the NDP's lunch on that as well. There's a whole host of hardworking men and women in this country who are without a home. And I think that that's a real opportunity for growth for Conservatives. I think be very proud to represent that demographic.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio. We will have to have you back as the leadership race unfolds and whenever we do get another general election. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me again. Great to be here. Happy to come back anytime.